All right, so last time we were talking about the mythical origins of Rome. You know, Romulus and Remus, the whole shebang. Yeah, it was a good story, but we all know that these founding myths can sometimes obscure the real history. Right. And today's deep dive is a great example of that, where I'm looking at the rise of the Roman Republic. You've got a ton of sources that really dig into the early centuries of Rome, from the influence of a civilization that actually predates Rome itself to the power struggles that shaped its political landscape. Yeah, and I think this one is going to be especially interesting for those listening who love military history. We're going to be talking about a civilization that went on to conquer vast swaths of Europe and beyond, and the seeds of that military power were sown right here in these early years. Definite, right? So before we talk kings, we need to talk about a civilization that had a big influence on Rome, the Etruscans. Oh yeah, the Etruscans, they were located north of Rome, and they were quite advanced for their time. Advanced metalworking, really vibrant art, a very structured society, and most importantly, they had a writing system that the Romans ended up adapting to create the Latin alphabet. I find that connection so fascinating. I mean, here we are, millennia later in modern European languages, even Chinese pinyin, are based on the Latin alphabet. It really shows just how interconnected history really is. And speaking of connections, get this, the Etruscan term for Rome's founder was, get this, Romulus. Okay, now that is interesting. So was that a single person, a title, or maybe a group, as some scholars think? Yeah, it kind of makes those early Roman accounts seem almost like their own origin myth, but completely true, but not entirely fiction either. Right. It's kind of like China's legendary 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. I mean, even the Etruscans, who are geographically and chronologically closer to the events than anyone else, they didn't have a perfectly clear picture of exactly who founded Rome. So we get this Etruscan influence, and then we get to Rome's second king, Numa Pompilius. Tell me about him. Well, unlike the more, let's say, warrior king image that we have of Romulus, Numa was a Sabine. And he was known for being peaceful, really focused on developing Rome internally. He reigned for 43 years and there were no wars. It was a very stark contrast to what Rome would eventually become known for. Sabine king, how did that happen? Well, it's actually quite interesting. Numa and Romulus were connected through marriage. They had a shared father-in-law, the Sabine king Tatius. This family connection probably helped to smooth the transition and to better integrate those two groups. Okay. So Numa comes in and changes the focus from outward conquest to, building up Rome's internal structures and its institutions. It seems like he's laying the groundwork for a more stable and less volatile society. You could say that, yeah, he was transforming Rome from a den of thieves into a more organized, I'd say civilized entity, and a key symbol of that was the Temple of Janus that he built. The Temple of Janus, okay. Janus was a pretty unique Roman god, wasn't he? Unremembered Greek equivalent. Yeah, there's no direct counterpart in Greek mythology. Janus was the god of beginnings and endings, transitions. He's often depicted with 2 faces looking in opposite directions, representing the past and the future. And that's why, January is named after him. The doorway to a new year, right. Okay, so how does the temple fit into all of this? So Numa wanted the temple to be a symbol of peace. The doors were supposed to be closed in times of peace and open during times of war. And amazingly, throughout Numa's whole reign, those doors stayed shut. I'm going to guess that didn't last very long. Yeah. Because Rome and perpetual peace don't really go hand in hand. You got that right. After Numa, those doors were almost never closed. Rome's later kings were all about expanding the kingdom. Like, for example, conquering the city of Ostia, which gave them access to the sea, which really set the stage for their future dominance of the Mediterranean. And, speaking of changes, Rome's 6th king, Servius Tullius, he put in place a big political reform, one that shifted power away from family connections and towards, wealth. And that was a huge change, especially for a kingdom that was really starting to grow its military might. Yes, this centuriate assembly. Tell me about it. So before Servius, there was the Curia Assembly, was based on family groups or gentes. But Servius Tullius, he replaced that with the Centuriate Assembly, which is structured around military units called centuries. Okay, so instead of relying on your family name, it was your wealth and your ability to actually equip soldiers that determined your level of influence. This is almost like, a precursor to a meritocratic system. Here, I'm sure it didn't work out exactly that way. You're getting it. So citizens were divided into 6 classes based on, their property. And the wealthiest class, because they could afford to equip the most soldiers, they had the most power within the assembly. And yeah, it was definitely not a perfect system. It had a lot of potential for inequality. It sounds like that really set the stage for some intense societal tension. Yeah. But before we go there, doesn't Servius Tullius meet how should I put this, a pretty dramatic end? Something about a family conspiracy. Oh yeah, a real family drama. So, Servius Tullius, he had a daughter who is, ambitious, let's just say. She conspired with her husband. He was the son of the previous king. They wanted to get rid of Servius Tullius and take over. And the stories about how Servius Tullius died are, well, pretty brutal. It's a reminder that even in ancient Rome, family affairs could be just as cutthroat as any battlefield. Palace intrigue was just as much a part of Roman life as military campaigns, it seems. So who was this power-hungry son-in-law who took over? Well, that would be Tarquinius Superbus, Rome's seventh and final king. And he was, well, his arrogance earned him the nickname Tarquinius the Proud. And his reign, as you can imagine, was all about tyranny. He was very disconnected from the people he ruled. Tarquinius the Proud. Doesn't sound like a very benevolent leader. Ooh. And then there was his son, Sextus Tarquinius. His actions, especially towards a woman named Lucretia, seem to have been what finally pushed the Romans over the edge. It's a story that really highlights how much resentment there was building up against the Tarquin family. Absolutely, Lucretia's story is pivotal. It really encapsulates all of that simmering discontent, and it was ultimately what sparked the overthrow of the monarchy and the birth of the Roman Republic. It's such a powerful story, I think it deserves its own space. I agree, we've already covered a lot, from Etruscan influences to kings rising and falling. I think our listeners need to really absorb this before we jump into that big turning point of the Republic. For sure, these early events, even with the legendary parts, they really set the stage for this civilization that would end up changing the map of Europe, and having a huge impact on military history too. Okay, so we left off talking about Tarquinius Superbus, a ruler whose arrogance really lived up to his name. And then there was his son, Sextus Tarquinius. His actions really sparked a revolution, and it's a story that shows the dangers of too much power in the hands of one person, and what happens when you ignore the people you rule. Yeah, definitely. Sextus Tarquinius' story really shows how even one person's actions can have a huge effect on history, especially in a society that was built on military might. Exactly. So let's get into this. Yeah, what exactly happened with Sextus Tarquinius and this woman, Lucretia? So the story goes that Sextus, he was visiting this town, Galatia, and he ended up in this arrow by a dumb bet with the commander there, a guy named Collatinus, about whose wife was the most virtuous. Ah, yes, classic male boasting. I'm sure that went well. Not really. So they went back to Collatinus's house and found Lucretia there. She was working hard with her servants. To them, this was proof of her character. But this visit went south fast. Sextus, he was overcome with lust, and that night he snuck into Lucretia's room and, well, he assaulted her. Wow, that's awful. And it goes against everything that Romans believed about virtue, which was super important. And absolutely. And tragically, Sextus forced Lucretia to do what he wanted. He threatened her, and she felt like she had no choice. The next day, she called her family and her husband together. She told them everything, and then she took her own life. That is just heartbreaking. And it must have really shaken the Romans. Her death became this symbol of how tyrannical and corrupt their leaders were. It was like a rallying cry saying, enough is enough to the monarchy and its power. It was huge. It wasn't just a personal tragedy. This was like a political earthquake. It showed everyone that the monarchy was rotten to its core, and it gave the people who had been unhappy for a long time a reason to finally fight back. Right, and this is where Lucius Junius Brutus comes in. He was the nephew of Tarquinius Superbus, remember? The one who pretended to be an idiot so he could survive. Exactly. Lucretia's death changed everything for Brutus. It's almost like her sacrifice woke him up. He suddenly had this fierce need to take on the monarchy, to get revenge for his family and for the whole Roman people. It's amazing that Brutus's actions weren't just about personal revenge. He really understood that people were angry and frustrated and wanted freedom. This desire to be free from oppression is something we see over and over again in history. He really became the voice of the people. He took the dagger from Lucretia's hand and rallied the people in Galatia and then marched to Rome. His speech in Rome, where he condemned the king and called for the Tarquin family to be kicked out, was a pivotal moment in Roman history. It shows how leaders can appear in the most unexpected places, driven by a cause bigger than themselves. And Brutus's call for revolution obviously resonated with the Romans. Oh yeah, the people had been putting up with the Tarquins' tyranny and corruption for years, and they were fed up. They rose up, kicked the whole Tarquin family out, and got rid of the monarchy altogether. Wow, that's incredible. So in 509 BC, that was the end of over 200 years of being ruled by kings. It's amazing to think that such a huge change started with one act of defiance sparked by Lucretia's tragic death. It's true, her story became this powerful symbol of resisting tyranny, a story that's inspired artists and thinkers for centuries. Even during the Renaissance, you see her in paintings and sculptures, a reminder of how strong her sacrifice was. It shows just how much humans desire freedom and justice. We all want a system of government that reflects what the people want. Speaking of which, what did this new republic actually mean for the Romans? How did this new system work? Well, the word republic comes from the Latin res publica, and that means like public affairs or things that belong to the people. So it was a fundamental shift. Instead of having one person, a king, calling all the shots, now power, at least in theory, was supposed to be shared among different groups. Okay, so no more all-powerful king. Instead, there was a collective process, though I doubt that everyone had equal say in how things worked. You're right on the money. We have to remember that the Roman Republic wasn't a democracy in the way we think of it today. It was more like an aristocratic republic. That meant that most of the power was still in the hands of wealthy elite families. They were called patricians. So the monarchy might be gone, but there was still a lot of inequality. Slavery was still around, and people who weren't citizens had no political rights. Exactly. The Roman Republic was a very complex system that was constantly changing. It was always trying to balance the power between the different social classes. To understand how the government worked, we need to look at the key parts that Brutus came up with. He imagined three main pillars: the Senate, the Centuriate Assembly that we talked about earlier, and a brand new position, consuls. The consuls. This is where things get really interesting, especially for us military history buffs. Were they basically elected kings or something completely different? Well, after what happened with the Tarquinians, the Romans didn't want to give too much power to just one person. So they came up with this really clever system. Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about these consuls. They decided to have two consuls instead of one ruler. They would share power and act as the main leaders of the republic. These two guys, they were elected every year and they had equal power. They could even veto or cancel each other's decisions. It was their way to stop another tyrant from taking over, and it's an idea that has influenced many governments throughout history. That's an amazing concept, dividing up power so that no one person has too much of it. But I imagine that having two leaders could create chaos and confusion. How did the Republic actually function with two people in charge? They thought of that too. Each consul's term only lasted 1 year, and they couldn't be elected again right away. This stopped any one consul from getting too powerful or starting a dynasty. It was a system designed for constant change in leadership. It's like a rotating presidency. That's a super unique way to run a government. So what did the consuls actually do? What was a typical day like for them? They were responsible for a ton of stuff. They led the army, made sure the government ran smoothly, represented Rome in dealings with other countries, and they even acted as judges. They were the face of the Republic, both within Rome and to the outside world. They had to handle all the challenges of a rapidly growing and powerful state. Wow, that sounds incredibly demanding. It must have taken a really special person to manage all of that, especially in a society where military success was so important. Well, remember that these consuls were chosen by the Centuriate Assembly, and the assembly was pretty much controlled by the wealthier member. So the consuls usually came from those elite families, the patricians. They were expected to be successful military commanders and shrewd politicians. Basically, they had to be good at leading on the battlefield and in the government. So even though the monarchy was over, it seems like the Roman Republic was still very much run by the aristocracy. Wealth and family connections were still extremely important. You got it. And the tension between those wealthy patricians and the regular people, the plebeians, that tension became a defining feature of the Roman Republic. It shaped their politics and caused a lot of internal conflict. But I think that's a story for our next deep dive. We've covered so much already, and I bet our listeners need some time to think about this change from a monarchy to a republic. Okay, so we've had these two consuls running the Roman Republic, sharing power, serving for a year, and then moving on. It's a pretty unique system, especially for those of us who are into military history. So how did this structure affect how Rome fought wars? Did having two leaders with the same amount of power help or hurt them on the battlefield? That's a really good question. And it's one that historians have been debating for, well, ages. I mean, on one hand, having two consuls, it could definitely lead to disagreements and delays in making decisions, which could have been bad for military operations.
Just imagine two generals trying to figure out a battle plan while the enemy's right outside the city.
Yeah, I could see how that could have been a disaster, especially in the middle of a battle.
Exactly, but on the other hand, this system had its advantages too. Having two consuls meant Rome could actually fight on two different fronts at the same time. One consul could be leading an army in Gaul, while the other one's off campaigning in Spain, for example.
All I see. So there's kind of a strategic advantage to have two commanders-in-chief. It gave them more flexibility, and they could react more quickly as their empire grew.
Exactly, and remember, these consuls weren't just there for show. They are supposed to be seasoned military leaders, guys who had risen through the ranks and proven themselves in battle. So even though they shared power, they were both capable of making tactical decisions and leading the troops effectively.
That makes a lot of sense. So it wasn't just about dividing power for the sake of it. They wanted a system that could stop tyranny, but also make sure the military was run well.
You got it. And it's important to think about the historical context here. Rome, even in its early days as a republic, was a society that was built on military strength. They believed that expansion and conquest were key to their survival and success, so any government they had to work with that.
It's really interesting how a government structure can reflect a society's values and priorities. In Rome's case, being good at war was such a huge part of who they were that it influenced how they set up their political system.
Absolutely, and I think that link between military power and political power continued throughout Roman history, even as the Republic changed and eventually turned into an empire.
Makes you wonder how things would have been different if Rome hadn't set up the system with two leaders. Would they have been as successful in their conquests? Would they have been able to adapt as quickly to new challenges on the battlefield?
Those are some great questions to think about. But unfortunately, we can't go back in time and see what would have happened. We can look at the evidence, though, and see what we think. And, well, considering how much Rome achieved in the centuries after they established the Republic, I'd say their system of having two consuls, despite some potential problems, was pretty effective for a rising military power.
It really shows how practical they were. They were willing to change their political system to meet the needs of their time. They came up with a way to keep things stable at home while still being powerful abroad. It's a balance that very few civilizations have been able to manage.
It's a really cool legacy, one that still fascinates historians and military buffs.
I think we did a good job of explaining this important period in Roman history. We saw how the Etruscans influenced their culture, how the kings set the stage for their greatness, and how the dramatic overthrow of the monarchy gave rise to a republic that went on to conquer so much of the world. It's a story about ambition, intrigue, tragedy, and in the end, the success of a civilization that totally changed the course of Western civilization.
Yeah. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage everyone listening to think about what all of this means in a bigger sense. How did those specific circumstances surrounding the birth of the Roman Republic, like getting rid of a tyrannical king, wanting to stop any one person from having too much power, the emphasis on military strength, how did these things shape what happened to Rome? How did they help Rome succeed, but also maybe contribute to their downfall later on?
Those are some really interesting things to consider. It reminds us that history isn't just a simple story. It's a mix of events, people, and ideas, all connected in complex ways. And as we've seen today, events from thousands of years ago can teach us a lot about the world we live in now.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll leave you to think about that.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the rise of the Roman Republic. We'll be back soon with another exciting look into history. Stay tuned.